What's the nature of your emergency?
Good morning, police, fire, military, and families, and to everybody who is listening in on the Talk to Living podcast. I'm your host, Ashley Welton, joined with my new friend from DC, Mr. Sean Carberry. Sean, how are you?
I'm doing well. Good morning, Ashley.
I'm really happy to have you, and I just wanted to publicly say this because I know the show is booked out for such a long time, and I looked back at the dates, and you actually booked this with us back in July, and October 17th is finally here. So I just wanted to thank you for your patience and for not canceling or rescheduling at the last minute when there was such a time length in between, because that always really sucks. So thank you so much.
Nope, you're welcome. Happy to be here.
We are doing a live giveaway. Good morning. Good morning. So you guys need to drop your comments down below. Whoever comments the most within 24 hours, I'm going to send you a 1-pound Halloween candy mix bucket with a white skull trick-or-treating basket. So I think we should let Derek Beasley win that one. That way he could take that out trick-or-treating, because something tells me he's probably going to take his dogs out trick-or-treating. Now, Sean, you are a former NPR Kabul correspondent and an author of Passport Stamps, which I was just checking out the reviews for, and I'm going to read one of them when we get into talking about some things, if that's okay, because
Sure.
You seem to have a great deal of accolades from people who have known you, people who currently know you. Good morning. Good morning. And I also listened to a couple of your interviews, and I'm hoping that with this one, we can maybe dive into a little bit more of the mental health side of things that I haven't heard you talk about before. So I hope that's okay.
Sure.
Now, if you don't mind telling us just a little bit about how you got into your career, and good morning, and how that led you to where you are now.
Yeah. I mean, my path has been really kind of winding in life. I came to journalism almost accidentally. I'd actually been working in the music business in the Boston area as a producer and engineer, and realized I needed to find something a little bit more stable work-wise, and saw a listing at the NPR station in Boston for a technical position. So I got hired there based on having audio production skills, and then was immediately thrown into a daily talk show and had to produce episodes and book guests and do all of the heavy journalism side. And a couple months after doing that, 9/11 happened. And so, obviously sort of a momentous event, and something that for me as a young journalist, I felt a need to really dig in and cover that, and saw journalists out in Afghanistan in the fall of 2001. And, just like a lot of people signed up to join the service after 9/11, there was a certain sort of calling to do more. And so I realized I wanted to eventually get out and do, on the ground journalism in Afghanistan and places like that. And over the course of the next bunch of years, gradually worked my way up to that, so that in 2007, 2008, had joined a radio program that was starting to send me to places like, I started with Sudan, Colombia, and then Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and eventually ended up 2.5 years in Kabul as the last NPR correspondent who was based there. And then at the end of 2014, shut the office and ended up back in the U.S. And at that point, trying to process, 7.5 years of running around in, very difficult places and seeing, a lot of horrible things, and, basically trying to process that and reintegrate into, being back in DC. And so that's sort of generally the journey, and what what I chronicle in the book is how I got into that work, how I didn't really know what I was doing early on, and a lot of the mistakes that I made, and then seeing the changes in me over time as I spent more time around post-conflict, around hostile environments, and over time dealing with losses of friends and colleagues and things like that. So it gets into a pretty heavy journey.
Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that, and I want to thank you for your service. And what we're talking about I feel like I've never heard anybody talking about before. If any of you have questions for Sean, go ahead and drop them down below. If we don't get to them, then we will make sure to tag you, Sean. And you just talked about something, and going into, you've been to over 80 countries. So going into some of the worst in terms of actual war zones and not being an armed service member, the dynamics of that are incredibly interesting. And what you just said was that you had to learn that reintegration. So there are programs, some better than others, of reintegration back into civilian life for an armed service member. But for somebody like you, were there any kind of services, or did you have any help when you made that kind of transition?
At the time, no, and so this is a key point that I've been trying to stress in both the book and in conversations, is that yes, there is an infrastructure for veterans. There is a VA. There are nonprofit organizations. I don't think there's nearly enough, but there is emphasis, and there are services that people can turn to, and there's recognition about the difficulty of coming back from downrange. But for journalists or other civilians, you think about it, how many people there are who are journalists, aid workers, development workers, diplomats, others who are also in these areas, dealing with some incredibly difficult circumstances, some who, survived attacks, some who lost colleagues. And it's really up to their individual organizations to deal with any type of mental health care or reintegration. And certainly when I came back, there was still very little recognition of that. At the time, NPR basically had some type of counselor who was on call. And so when I got back, they said, look, if you need to talk to someone, there's a guy you can call. And, of course, no one's going to follow up on that. I mean, we see that, across the board in, military or first responders. If it's purely voluntary, we're all, no, I'm fine. I'm good. I don't need anything. And, I just didn't realize at all at the time when I got back how affected I was. And it played out over years in terms of, really understanding how different I was on the back end, and how hard it was to relate to people, and how I got into making bad life choices and things like that. So, there's a little bit more awareness today, but there really isn't anything on the civilian side that's kind of like a VA for civilians who work in these environments. And so that's, again, a key part of what I'm trying to raise awareness around.
It's very important, and there's a lot of value to be had in a conversation like this. So I thank you for sharing that. And for anybody who may not know, can you just talk to us a little bit about the similarities between somebody working in a civilian capacity in a war zone like you have, and that of a first responder or an armed service member?
Yeah, I think there is, enormous overlap that, as I have conversations with people and talk with veterans and first responders, we all kind of see, how much there is in common. In my case, I mean, yes, I did, a lot of embeds. So I had time where I was out, on patrols and on bases with the military. So I'm, sort of surrounded by the same, danger and concerns. But even just living in Kabul, I mean, anytime you heard a loud noise, my job wasn't to go, in the basement and seek shelter. It was to go get as close to that noise as I could. So I remember one time, driving home from an interview in the middle of the day in Kabul, and we hear a boom and see smoke rising. I just turned to my driver. I'm like, go over there. Again, that same as first responders, you run to the boom. That's the job. And so then you're there, you're watching, the Afghan forces try to deal with the attack. Then afterwards, you're trying to interview anyone involved in it, victims, et cetera. So, you're consuming a lot of the same trauma and danger. And, in my case, the main difference is obviously I wasn't armed, and it wasn't my job to pull a trigger. But you're still dealing with a lot of the same stresses and trauma and sort of questions about, why are people doing this to each other, things like that. And, when you come back again, you do feel different from other people. There were some folks in Kabul that I was friends with who had moved to DC before I did. So I had a little bit of what I refer to as a tribe of people who I could relate to. But I think that's part of it that's really important is having that community of people. But the other thing I'll just say quickly is in 2020, when I was just kind of personally hitting bottom and looking around trying to find some type of therapy that really dealt with the circumstances I had been through, I found that it was programs for veterans and first responders were the kinds of things that were the right thing. But I couldn't get into those because I hadn't worn a uniform, even though, again, there was tremendous overlap with the experiences, with what I was dealing with on the back end. And that also just kind of opened my eyes to this issue that, I can sit with veterans and first responders and we can talk and share things and have a tremendous amount in common. But I, as a civilian, can't access certain, care or programs or resources to try to work through some of that. And so that, again, a key thing that I'm trying to do is help, sort of build that bridge. And a lot of vets who I've talked to, when I describe some of my experiences, they're like, wow, I went through the exact same thing. And so, again, I think it's, important to build that recognition, and at a minimum, at least, communities can support each other, let alone, as I say, trying to find more resources for civilians who have had these kinds of experiences who didn't specifically wear a uniform of some kind.
Yeah, it's a massive gap in the system that I'm surprised nobody has spoken out about sooner, which means that there's probably all the more individuals who are out there just silently coping with this. So I'm so proud to know somebody who identified a problem and is now working through it. If the military could not see the impact on our military personnel, they definitely wouldn't see the impact on the civilian personnel and wouldn't see the need, to help our civilians. Absolutely. This is one of those selfish Ashley questions, Sean. So
Sure.
we see the content, we see the newscasts, we read the articles, and that's like the finality, the aftermath of some of the work that you've done as a war correspondent. But what is it actually like? What is a day in the life actually like when you're out there?
Yeah, and that was sort of a big part of the motivation of the book, is exactly that point, is people people hear the story, they read the story, but there are days and hours and sometimes weeks of running around someplace that go into it. And some of it's kind of mundane, running from one government office to another, trying to get permissions, trying to get approvals to travel to places. But then there's just all kinds of crazy things. I mean, one of the things that people don't realize is how difficult it is to travel around in some of these places. And so some of the things that we have to do to get from one place to another, and hiring, sketchy drivers and getting into cars that really aren't safe or well maintained, or driving through places where there really aren't roads. I joke about the fact that as a journalist, you break all the rules your parents told you as a kid. Number one is don't get in cars with strangers. Well, as a journalist, the first thing you do is get in cars with strangers. With the first time I went into Libya from Egypt, we took a train from Cairo to Alexandria and ended up in a bus station parking lot. And there were a bunch of guys standing around, just said, "Hey, who wants to drive us into Libya?" And, guys chatted with each other. One guy's like, "Okay, I'll do it." And we negotiated a price with this random guy in a parking lot and got in his car and drove to Libya. So, there's a sort of a high risk factor in that regard. So getting around places, but then, navigating checkpoints and, reading local dynamics, trying to figure out, is it safe to go to the next village? Who do you have to have a local person come with you to talk you through the next checkpoint? So, tons of that sort of like ground level intel and just reading situations and finding the right people and things like that to be able to get in and around. And certainly in my case, lots of situations where I was very near to something happening that I didn't find out till afterwards. It's like, oh, actually the people after you at that checkpoint got robbed, or this or that happened. So, there's a tremendous amount of luck that goes on, but the key thing is what we call fixers, who are sort of the local journalists who we hire, who know the area, the community, the language, the bureaucracy, all those things. And those people really are critical to getting foreigners in and out of places safely. And those people take, even more risk than a lot of the foreign correspondents do. But yeah, it's a lot of improvisation, a lot of talking your way through circumstances of, trying to get a permit to go somewhere, trying to find a flight, trying to find a car, getting in strange boats in rivers in Colombia. Again, some of it on the back end, a lot of it's fun and it's great stories. But in the moment, you're like, this is probably a bad idea. I really hope, we get a good story out of this.
So, Sean, does the fixer act as essentially your escort?
Yeah. I mean, they are, they're really your partner. I mean, if I'm going into a place, say I'm going into the Congo, I'll reach out ahead of time, weeks ahead of time, to find a fixer. You go through networks of other journalists. Who do they recommend? Get in touch with that person, start talking about where you want to go, the reporting you want to do. And they'll, advise you, okay, you're going to need this permit. You're going to need, a car to get here. You're going to need this. So they really handle logistics. And in many cases, they translate for you. So, I talk a lot about the fact that, fixers are really the backbone of international reporting. And, most of the time we go into a place, we do some reporting and we leave, and they stay there and they work with the next person, and they take, constant risk. And unfortunately, it's local journalists who are the ones who are arrested, injured, killed in far greater numbers than the international correspondents. And so, these people deserve tremendous amount of credit for the risks that they take and what they do to help everyone get the news out.
Yeah, I'm truly sorry that you were overlooked, and I thank you for being that voice for those overlooked and for the silent. Thank you for your role played. Absolutely. And so, okay, now my question is you have a fixer. They tell you all of the ins and outs, where to go, where not to go, how to get there. So are they armed? And do you have any kind of form of protection for yourself, being that you yourself are not armed?
So no, I never had an armed fixer. The only time, there's one time when I was in Baghdad in, I think, 2009, and I had a driver and I did have a security guy in the car, plain clothes, and he was armed, and then a fixer. So the four of us were driving around Baghdad. But we were all, we were in a nondescript, an old Mercedes that looks like every other car in the streets in Baghdad. And the vast majority of time I spent in places, it was in, sort of a local car, local people. You're trying to blend in as much as possible. There was one time in Libya for a few days, the driver we were using, he was sort of a Libyan rebel, and he was armed and a little twitchy, but it was, at that time, you had to grab whatever driver you could because it was during the fall of Tripoli. So all the journalists are pushing into the city and competing for, the local talent of who's available to drive and fix. And so, we did have a few days of this guy. And as soon as we could, we replaced him because we felt he was more dangerous than anything else. But no, I felt more uncomfortable. For example, there were times I would travel in UN vehicles or State Department vehicles if I was going out to see, their projects. And, these big white vehicles to me were just advertisement to anyone. It's like, hey, foreign people, target this. So I was always much more comfortable in a beat up Toyota Corolla than anything else.
Yeah, being so naive to this topic, and I'm glad you're shedding light on it. My interpretation, like when you see that, the final cut, right? Somebody just, a published news outlet publishing your story, for example, you would have thought that somebody like Sean is out there being escorted by an armed guard the entire time, ensuring your safety. So that actually is incredibly surprising and harrowing, actually. So yes, thank you. I echo that sentiment of whoever said that down below. And I know we don't have tons of time. I feel like I can keep keep asking you a million questions, so we might have to have you come back on if that's okay. But
Happy
what took you then from then coming home, reintegrating back into civilian life after being in a war zone, and then figuring out something isn't quite right, and then going from that transition into, doing what you needed to do to feel the way that you wanted to feel when you did come back into civilian life?
So, when I got back, I knew I was changed, and I knew things felt different, and I felt difficulty um, relating with friends or family or people who hadn't had similar experiences. I mean, same things that, you hear from veterans. They feel, isolated. They don't feel comfortable with friends and family. People ask them questions about their service that are, uncomfortable to talk about. So a lot of those kinds of feelings, and a lot of the sort of, chronic PTSD of, walking around the streets, can't have anyone behind me, loud noises startling me, all that kind of stuff. And so I was sort of aware of that. But really it was, over the course of years, shortly after I got back, I got into gambling. I ended up in a relationship with an abusive partner. I mean, just sort of all the cliches of things that happen when they're just sort of not right and thrust into circumstances that they can't really process well. And so, that just kind of continued for a period of time. And then I was in a good job. Seemed functional on the outside, but was still processing being away from that world that I'd worked in for years. And, in 2020, during COVID, and between the isolation and frustration on the job, everything just kind of came to a head. And I was just in a really, really bad place. And that's why I say I started looking around for some help, and saw that there were programs for first responders and others, but there wasn't something directly that made sense to me. And I just finally kind of pulled back, realized, I need to write my book now. Something I'd thought about for years, but like, I need to get this out. I need to process the experiences again, just kind of work through things, and get this out, and have this as kind of a step toward healing and doing something with all of it. And so I basically spent 2021 and early 22 writing the book, and then that point came back into the workforce. The book finally came out last summer, and so again, really trying to the call to action is really trying to raise more awareness around mental health for civilians who work in these environments. And, just more broadly, just add more weight to the conversation around mental health in general, and try to remove stigma. I do work with the organization Movember, which is a men's health organization. They focus, originally they started with prostate cancer, but then got heavy into mental health and suicide prevention. And so again, doing things with them. But, the nice thing is that at least I just had someone a week or so ago tell me that after reading my book, he decided to seek help. His wife had passed away within the last year, and he was sort of toughing his way through things. And after reading my book, decided, no, I can't, put on the brave face. I really need to kind of sit down and get some help. And there's nothing wrong with that. And so, it was just one sort of small recent example of reaching someone and seeing, okay, this can make a difference, telling the story, trying to remove stigma for men in particular to seek mental health care, and make this just part of health in general.
Yeah, for sure. I was not aware of personnel not being protected and or having a fixer. I thought that the media or TV stations were taking care of that. 1000%. That was exactly what I thought too. So my final question here, Sean, is what is next for you?
So, right now I'm still immersed in, doing book publicity and trying to get this messaging out. There are some organizations that I'm trying to have conversations with, that deal with trauma and mental health and journalism, trying to continue elevating this conversation. So, really right now, the short-term focus is continuing to have this conversation, raise awareness and see what opportunities come out of it to try to build and make, mental health care and treatment part of the regular process for news organizations, for aid organizations, and things like that.
Okay, so everybody who is listening to this, if you could do us a favor and share this episode with somebody who might value from being able to hear it. Your testimony is the most powerful tool to help others. 100%. Sean, I see your book in the background. Do you mind just holding it up? I did see that we can check it out on Amazon.
Yep.
I know that your website here is passport-stamps.com. Thank you.
Yeah.
Such a cool book. I really, really like that.
Yeah,
And,
we had fun. It started with a scan of my actual passport, and then we had fun with rearranging the logo to make it a little bit more thematic and all that. But yeah, passport-stamps.com is the book website, and passportstamps.net is my Substack, where I also write about foreign policy, and I write some of the stuff. When I wrote the book, it was twice the length of a book, so all sorts of material that didn't end in the final book, I've been sort of dribbling out on Substack. So all the weird stories about taking cargo flights in South Sudan to get to reporting locations and things like that are all in there.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you for dropping that website down below. Thank you so much for the work that you do, the work that you're continuing to do, and for enlightening us and really sharing some things that I think none of us might have even considered before, but it's something that we definitely need to increase the conversation around. But stick around, because I do want to talk to you a little bit more. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in. If you have any more questions, make sure to drop them down.
911, what's the nature of your emergency?